To 7. He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them.
Well, hello and welcome to this special edition of Islands at War. This is Nick Lahure speaking. No Keith this week. Keith's away taking a look at an archive. I've just returned to the island this morning after a very exciting weekend at the Imperial War Museum. I was there on Saturday, the 1st of November, taking part in their podcast live event, which was absolutely brilliant. We recorded an episode of Islands at War in front of a live audience. The museum, it was great to see that the whole event was a sellout. There were some brilliant podcasts there. History Rage with Paul Bavell, Ian from Cold War Conversations, Colin from the Unconventional Soldier podcast, Jackson from History with Jackson. For You, The War Is Over. It was great to see the guys from that. If you haven't caught any of those podcasts, I do highly recommend them, covering a whole gambit of history, which you learn so much from these guys. There were some brilliant historians there as well. Alex Churchill, Dr. Helen Fry, Claire Mully, Damien Lewis, and I'm sure some of those names will be familiar to people. They've all published books. It was great to chat to them as well. And a big thank you to the Imperial War Museum and also to Paul Bavell of History Rage for getting us invited along to take part in this event. The whole day was a sellout. It was great to see so many people there and a varying range of understandings of the occupation of the Channel Islands for the session that I recorded, which was really nice to see. You know, some people had a reasonable knowledge of the occupation, and for others, they were there to find out for the first time a little bit more, other than the fact that we had been occupied. I had a great guest, Head of Public History at the Imperial War Museum, James Bulgin, who has had a varied career, spanning anything from musical theatre to becoming a historian and appearing on a number of documentaries, as well as curating the Holocaust Galleries at the museum. A big thank you as well to Kerry Thomas, friend of the show, who very kindly came along all the way from Wales to help out with all the tech, etc. in Keith's absence, whilst we were recording, including running around with the microphone for people to be able to ask questions. So, with no further ado, I shall hand you over to the recording of the podcast.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for coming to the first ever IWM podcast live. So this is our opportunity to celebrate the world of podcasting. So I'm Phil Crawford, so I'll be this room host for this morning. And I'm delighted to open the day with a fascinating talk today about the remarkable stories from the Channel Islands at War. So today in this session, we welcome Nick Lahure, the creator of Islands at War, a podcast that explores the German occupation of the Channel Islands during the Second World War. It was the only part of the British Islands to fall under Nazi rule, and through personal stories, diaries and local accounts, Nick brings those years vividly to life. He's joined by James Bulgin, the head of public history here at the Imperial War Museum, who will help to uncover what everyday life was like under occupation and how those experiences shaped our understanding of the war. Their conversation will run for around 40 minutes, followed by audience questions. So please join me in welcoming Nick and James.
Thank you very much, Phil. I'm, as Phil said, Nick Lahure, my other co-host for the podcast. Keith is detained because, like buses, one invite comes along and promptly so does another. So we couldn't be in two places at once. So Keith's off looking at a very exciting archive to do with the Channel Islands, which is held in the UK and has not been available to the public. So more on that coming out in our podcast later on. James has very kindly joined me. We had a bit of a chat a few weeks ago just to to see what James knew about the Channel Islands, and I found out you've got a bit of a connection with the Channel Islands, James.
I do. In a sort of a former professional life, I was an actor and a theatre producer and director and stuff, and my co-producer of my production company was a chap called Paul Morrissey, was from Guernsey, and so we were looking at opportunities to take stuff over to the Channel Islands. But one of the things we were able to do through that period of time was to become the first professional producers to take Les Miserables over to to Guernsey. Because one of the things which you may not be aware of is that Victor Hugo wrote the novel on Guernsey, but the musical had never been performed in Guernsey. So it had been all around the world, but it had never been to Guernsey. So we became this company that took it there, and it was one of these bizarre moments where we put it on sale and it sold out virtually instantly. And then afterwards, had an incredible cast in fairness, but they afterwards realised that people from all over the world had been over to see it because it was this kind of really significant moment. So it kind of nurtured this relationship that I had with the islands, and we went back year after year doing different bits and pieces. So I spent a lot of time across both islands.
Yeah, and there's every possibility I went to one of your productions.
Possibly. I mean, I will say, in Les Miserables was a rare moment where I dusted off the old performing costume. And so if those of you who know Les Miserables, I played Marius in that production, but that was rare. So you may well have seen me do that. But other than that, yeah.
Yeah. So how did you end up here at the IWM? That's quite a different role.
It's a strange story. I was doing all that stuff, and then I got invited to go and see this musical called Imagine This. Whilst I was producing shows, we got given a bursary by the Society of London Theatre, and they put us up with a producer in London, a chap called Lee Menzies, and he was managing a show called Imagine This, which was at the New London Theatre at the time. So I went to see it apropos of nothing at all. And essentially, the Imagine This was the story of the Masada, but set within the Warsaw Ghetto. That was the whole premise. And I, within about 20 minutes, thought, this is horrendous. You know, not as a piece of art, but as conceptually, I just couldn't reconcile myself to the idea that musical theatre, which is a genre which I had a profound sort of personal investment in. I believe in musical theatre, but I just thought this doesn't seem like the right way of dealing with this history. But I don't really know what this history is. I didn't really know anything about the Warsaw Ghetto or much about the Holocaust at all. So I went home and fired off an email to one of my lecturers from university when I did an English degree and said, look, I remember you said something to me once said something to all of us about writing poetry after Auschwitz. What was it? And he said, oh, you're talking about Theodor Adorno, who, some of you might know this line. Theodor Adorno said, to write lyric poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. That was his sentiment. It's a slightly more complex sentiment than it seems on face value, but nevertheless, it basically kick-started an interest in the subject. So I ended up doing a master's in the Holocaust, then ended up doing a PhD in the Holocaust, and then ended up here and was here on a short-term job working in the publishing department, and a job was advertised to redo the Holocaust galleries at the museum, and I kind of applied expecting nothing, to be honest with you, because I was completely unqualified for it. I had no experience in any meaningful way, but thankfully, in the room just next door, actually, was where the interview was. I had flu at the time, and my second son had just been born 8 weeks premature, so I was completely... You know those experiences in life where you just think, is this happening? Is this real, or is it a dream? Not a nice dream either, because it was really trippy. So I... then got a call a few weeks later saying, yeah, we'd like you to do the job. And it was one of those bizarre sort of sliding doors moments where life just went herring off in a different direction. And 10 years, nearly 11 years later, I'm still here. That was never the plan.
Yeah, and the Holocaust touched on the Channel Islands. There is a connection with that in that there were camps in Alderney. There was the Pickles report which came out investigating that. There's still various conversations going on around that, and we're not going to delve into that today, but that's kind of the connection where we're coming from with this. You've also done documentaries as well for the BBC and various others. I guess some of that must have been fairly harrowing, having watched a few of them.
Yeah, it certainly can be. I mean, I think it's a thing that people say, and obviously you'll know this with the history of the islands and the sort of the closeness of it. I think that's one of the things that I've become very sort of conscious of. When you talk to people for whom these things aren't history as such, they're kind of lived, family memory, and that's a very different way of approaching these things. So. It's often said of people who deal with the subject here that you develop various coping mechanisms, and it's necessary to do so. I would say that the organisation actually is ever conscious of this now. I mean, it's now part of anyone who's kind of onboarded in this organisation now has to sort of discuss how they will deal with working amongst this history, because I think in a way it's a bigger problem to not be affected by it.
Absolutely.
I think if you ever get to a stage where you're completely inured by it and untouched and unfeeling, then something's gone wrong. But I think some of the places that I've been to, it tends to come out of left field. Certainly, sometimes it's a detail or it's a moment or it's something that just catches you off guard and you think, God, this is awful. But obviously it's a professional obligation to deal with things with a degree of kind of detachment and objectivity. So that's what we do.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about people talking about it and it being in living memory. One of the challenges that there's been in the Channel Islands for many years is a lot of people did not want to talk about it. As soon as they got to the end of the war, they'd lived through the occupation. They'd had 5 years being occupied by the Germans, and they just didn't want to talk about it. That was it. They filed it away in their mind, and I'm not talking about it. Or they'd talk a little bit around it, but not really that much. And one thing that we've noticed over the certainly doing the podcast, and I've been involved in talking to people about aspects of the occupation for many years. But as time's gone on and people are getting older, and we're the last of that generation, there's a few people around that were teenagers at the time. They're in their 90s now. They're suddenly, there seems to be amongst some of them a need to get it off their chest, what they endured, what their families endured, because some of them, they were relatively young when they were either evacuated to the UK or they stayed with their families in the Channel Islands. And there seems to be a bit of an outpouring from some of them. And some of them have just got pin-sharp memories. And it can be really quite touching. I interviewed a lady called Melva Stacey, who would be 97 now. I interviewed her last year, and she was quite clear about things that had happened. She was possibly the easiest interview I've ever done. I sat down with her for 5 minutes in her lounge. She still lives alone in an apartment. I sat down with her and I said, "Look, Melva, these are the sorts of things I'd like to talk about. Are you happy to talk about them?" And she said, "Oh yes, that's absolutely fine." I asked her the first question. 45 minutes later, she finished. It was brilliant. I think I might have made a few listening noises, but other than that, so it is really difficult. And some of the things, I interviewed another lady earlier this year who became very emotional. We had to stop the interview a few times because she found it quite helpful. She wanted to talk about it, but she found it quite hard to talk about it because her family had endured some fairly horrible things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point, but it's a very active period at the moment, actually, for exactly that reason, I think, in terms of the history of the Second World War. I feel there's a really palpable sense of lots of different things occurring simultaneously that are to do with this precipice of living memory. I mean, I think it's interesting to me in terms of, two things, actually. First thing, in terms of those kind of engaging with histories and not engaging with them. There's an interesting anecdote that I have from the BBC film that I did called How the Holocaust Began, that some of you may have seen. I think it's still on the iPlayer. But basically, we went to we were filming in Lithuania. So we went to this little former shtetl, actually, called Butrimunis. And we were filming there, but because it's so rural and remote, it was quite an unusual thing for a kind of a BBC. It was a small team, but it was still a BBC camera, stuck in the middle of the square. And there was a bit of local interest. And we were there because in 1941, there'd been a mass shooting of the town's, or the shtetls Jews. They'd just been walked down a road and shot. Absolutely horrendous. So as we were filming, some of these locals came out and they said, "Oh, there's a lady living here who was here at the time. Would you like to speak to her?" Now, everything else in the documentary had been quite structured. Like, we went into situations with the director kind of having, you have this thing in documentaries called beats. So the director says, these are the beats that we want to hit in this piece. So we got to this piece, and I had the beats that we wanted in. And then suddenly they said, and so the director said, well, we need to get it. So if you do watch the doc, I can say to you, that whole sequence in the doc is completely authentic. We literally got in a car, drove over to her house, went, met her, put her in the car, drove her over. And it was really, her name was Ona Bodrikina. She was lovely. She, obviously in her late 90s, very frail, but because she was so small, she sort of sat in the back of the car and couldn't see over the windows. So we were driving down this road, and she was saying to this lady we had with us who was interpreting Ruta, said, oh, my family used to live there, and it was just a field, and there was nothing there. And I sort of thought, oh, that's weird. There's no trace of any habitation there now, so maybe her memory's failing her or something. And then we got to this bit, because there's a modernish road now, sort of tarmac road. And then she said, oh, there's a bridge just here. And I looked out the window and thought, there's a stream underneath this bit of road. And clearly the modern road has pushed the bridge down, so the bridge is no longer a bridge. But she knew exactly where the water bit was, the necessity. And I thought, she knows exactly where we are. She can't see that because she can't see over the top, but she knows exactly where we are. So we got to the bit, we got out, we filmed the bits, and I said to her, what do you remember about this? And she said, oh, not much. And she said bits and pieces, and it was all pretty kind of incomplete. And it was all fine, and it was a really hot day, so we didn't want to push her, obviously, so she just did the bit and then put her back in the car, and the runner on the film took her back. And he said when they got her back, they got her into the house, sat her down, and she opened up about the whole thing and told them all the things that she remembered that she didn't say to us. Now, I don't know whether she didn't say it to us because she didn't want to say it into a camera, or she didn't say it because her brain needed time to sort of filter it through. But I thought, God, how interesting. That is two completely different narratives that are formed alongside each other. But I think in terms of the Channel Islands, there's this. I think there's the issue of individual memory, but there's also been a much broader thing where there was. It feels to me that there was like a reticence for decades to acknowledge the Channel Islands because there is a degree of sort of humiliation that accompanies it. Yeah,
very, very, very much so, and the narratives that were put out around it, post-war in terms of, oh well, they must have all been collaborating and all this sort of thing, when actually the reality is somewhat different. Now, there couldn't be active resistance. For example, Guernsey, 25 square miles. You've got no mountains to run to if you go and carry out, you shoot some Germans or whatever. You can't run away to a forest. You can't disappear into some mountains. You're just going to get rounded up and shot.
Yes.
If you get away with it. Jersey, they're a little bit bigger, but they still had similar issues. But there were what Paul Sanders and Julie Carr call acts of defiance in one of their books, and I think that is more like it. That was a form of resistance in doing things that they knew they weren't allowed to do, chalking V's up, things like that, listening to the BBC when the radios had all been confiscated, distributing news. I mean, people died for some of the acts of resistance, Guns being one of them, which was Guernsey Underground News Service, who used to transcribe the BBC broadcasts, and they'd put out a typed sheet which would be left. Lloyd's Bank in St Peterborough if you've seen any documentaries about the occupation, you'll have seen the band marching past Lloyd's Bank because it's in every documentary about the Channel Islands. Yes. Because it is quite an iconic building as well. But if you went in and asked the right question, the manager knew you could go in there and he'd let you have a book to have a look at while you were there, and inside that the libraries also had them, and various other trusted people were given them. But sadly they were betrayed by somebody. One of the gentlemen died, and that happened on numerous occasions where people were caught doing things that they weren't allowed to.
And they ended up in concentration camps, didn't they? Yep. I mean, this is a thing which I don't think is particularly well covered. That they were, British.
British people from the Channel Islands. So a large number ended up deported in internment camps at Laufen and Biberach and stuff like that. Now, those weren't concentration camps, but people who got basically what is missed by a lot of people is if you broke the rules and you came up on the German radar, you might get in trouble for some minor misdemeanor and get sent to Guernsey prison or Jersey prison, but your name was there, you were a marked person, and they would find any excuse. So people quite often were rapidly shipped off island without anybody knowing what happened to them, and they'd be shipped around prisons all around France, and finally end up in Germany. There were a couple that ended up in concentration camps, and some that didn't die. Quite sadly, there was one gentleman who was sent to prison in Germany relatively early on. I think it was early 1941. He actually died making his way back to Guernsey after the end of the war. He got as far as Belgium.
What happened?
He was just so ill from the whole experience that he died a matter of days after the war, coming back through Belgium. Who's being repatriated.
Extraordinary.
But there were numerous Channel Islanders.
But also there was, and Gilly Carr, Professor Gilly Carr talks about this, that when Belgium was liberated, there was an islander.
Yes.
In Belgium, there was a British prisoner liberated at Belgium by the 11th Armoured, which is a really fascinating and kind of appalling detail.
And one of the Channel Islanders was sent to one of the other camps after it had been liberated to go and witness some of what was going on.
Yeah, I suppose what the islands do as well, and this in terms of this thing about kind of active history, is that they definitely do offer a kind of a historiographic like crucible for examining how occupation might have unfolded had it happened here. That's the thing so. And I wonder if that to some extent that's why there's been a degree of kind of reticence, because it's more comforting and reassuring to assume that things wouldn't necessarily turn out in certain ways, and obviously...
Yeah, and the way that the Germans behaved throughout the occupation changed, because initially it was with a view to sea lion taking place and them going to England. So they treated the population far better at the start of the occupation than as things developed later on. And when we get to the dying months of the occupation, the commandant in charge of the Channel Islands was a very ardent Nazi who was holding out. Basically, said he would hold out. They will come for us. He held a rally in March 1945 for his men, saying that don't worry, they will come for us in March 1945. I'm not really sure
that's not.
I mean, basically, we ended up shortly after D-Day as a very large prisoner of war camp, which didn't need any guards.
But I think that is a thing as well, which isn't particularly well known or understood. Obviously, the strategic decision was made on D-Day to just circumvent the go around the edge. So D-Day is pushing on through, Northern Europe and on eventually towards Germany, and the Channel Islands just sit here, and of course that means that supply routes, etc., get increasingly cut off.
Yeah.
So starvation, etc., becomes more and more of an issue. So ironically, even though they're so close to Britain, to the mainland, the circumstances there get worse as the war comes nearer to conclusion.
Very, very, very much so, and more people would have died if it had not been for the Red Cross eventually being allowed in December 1944 to come to the Channel Islands with supplies, and they made 5 trips, I think it was, in total between that and the end of the war. And again, I think there's also this narrative around Churchill abandoned the Channel Islands, which kind of ties in with why they weren't liberated sooner. That basically there would have been huge loss of life. There were several operations that were planned and got quite far down the line, ironically led by Mountbatten in a lot of cases. He had Churchill's ear and was keen to take... Churchill was furious that they had to give up the Channel Islands in the first place anyway. They came to some fairly well-advanced plans, including training in some cases, which those men went on to take part in the Dieppe raid instead.
Okay.
But they looked at it, and when you read some of the plans, that you can get them from the National Archives at Kew, you read the discussions, and it's just like, good Lord, they're talking about using 700 bombers in some of the later ones for 3 days before they mount the attack.
Soften it up before.
You would have just killed most of the civilian population.
But it's one stat which really sticks with me is that 10% of the Atlantic Wall was on the Channel Islands.
Yes.
So, I mean, it seems crazy. I mean, it just seems like such a sort of a massive strategic blunder from Hitler's perspective.
Absolutely.
To invest so much resource into a territory that Britain was never going to bother to to invade.
Yeah, absolutely. And it had been agreed in 1925 by the British government that the islands were of no strategic value whatsoever, and that slightly ironically that the only country that might seek to invade the Channel Islands would be France, who we'd been fighting on the same side of some 7 years previous, which was a slightly odd notion. But the professional German military acknowledged that it was a complete and utter waste of time, but Hitler was obsessed with it, and it becomes his island obsession. Which is why we end up with a ridiculous amount of fortifications. There's plenty there still to see. Do come and visit us. I'm a tour guide as well, so I've got a vested interest. But there are a lot of fortifications in the Channel Islands to come on all of the islands to visit. Not so much on Sark, although Sark has a lot of history to do with the occupation, not so much the physical stuff. It was complete madness. We ended up with about 65,000 landmines laid in Guernsey. It was acknowledged after the war by one of the previous commandants that 30,000 would have been enough, but Hitler insisted nope. He kept getting maps out, was looking at the Channel Islands, and that's one of the reasons that people ended up in Laufen and Bibracte was a retaliation for German expats in Persia being interned by the Allies.
Okay.
Hitler went, hang on, I've got some British subjects somewhere. Right, I want 10 for every one to go. Fortunately, it didn't get to the 10 for everyone because that would have been about 8,000 people. But it was about 2,000.
But the ratio of occupiers to islanders was absurd, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 3 to 1 in some cases.
In terms of 3 to 1 Germans
one German for every
3. I mean, which is by any normal metric an absurd, way of operating. But you do find this quite a lot, actually. I think that there can be a tendency to sort of indulge the idea that Hitler was this kind of brilliant strategic mind, and then you look at other things and you think he really isn't. A lot of he's completely clueless.
Absolutely, and they built things like the Miras battery, this huge naval gun battery, which never really saw action. They detected a ship, got very excited, opened fire on it, and then found out the next day it was a partially deflated barrage balloon from one of their own ships that had been drifting around, and that's all they succeeded in doing. They did like having their artillery practice. They used to do that regularly, but then they never really got into any serious battles. The only thing was the RAF, and again this completely blows people's minds, is the RAF regularly attacked fortifications in the Channel Islands and shipping around the area, and most people are just like, what, really? I mean, Castle Cornet, beautiful castle, hundreds of years of history, and probably also the only British castle to have been attacked by the RAF.
Is that true?
Yeah. It was attacked by the RAF in the run-up to D-Day.
Okay.
But they had a huge amount of flak positions there. They were attacking Fort George, which is nearby, which had radar installations, but also attacked the castle because it had a lot of anti-aircraft guns on it.
And did they do much damage?
They didn't do much damage to the castle itself. They did a lot of damage to the radar installations, but the worry being that this was in the days immediately prior to D-Day, the worry being that they would spot the invasion fleet for D-Day with the radar and get the message out.
Interesting.
So that was why they did that. But going back to what you're doing, James, I mean, you've got another book coming out.
I do. I've got, well, actually, two books this year. So if anyone has any interest whatsoever in the creation of the Holocaust Galleries at the museum, we published a book in August, and I'm saying this to you now with no personal skin in the game, apart from the fact it's nice to know people are reading it. I don't make anything out of this. It was published with an academic publisher, De Gruyter, which means that for the academic market it's expensive, because that's just how that market works. But we cut a deal with the publishers that if you buy it here in person, it's significantly less. So the edition that you can buy here can only be bought here. It can't be bought online either, because obviously that would undermine what the publishers are doing. So that came out in August, and that was basically, since the galleries had opened, I talked to various people and do various tours and stuff, and people kept on saying, have you written any of this down? And I always said no, but it would be great to have the opportunity. And then a lovely German academic, actually, who's based at the University of Manitoba in Canada, said, would you like to work on a book? So we worked on this book together. So it's a long essay from me about the process by which the galleries are created. And I would say that's about museology, not just about the subjects. Because I came into this like green as you like. That's not a thing. I didn't know anything really about how museums work at all, as most of my team will testify. And sort of learned it on the job. So it sort of articulates the way that I came to understand how a gallery opens. Because I would say now, if you go into any of our permanent exhibitions here, the amount of stuff that goes on beneath the surface to make it happen is crazy. Like, it's a 6-year process. So hopefully it'll be of interest to that. And there's various other people who are involved writing about it, and then some academics kind of writing critiques about various things. So there's that. But also next month, very soon, is... In fact, not next month, this month, because it's November, isn't it?
Yeah, it is November today, yeah.
Is our book about Nuremberg. So this 20th of this month is the 80th anniversary of the start of the IMT in Nuremberg. A huge seminal moment for international law, international justice, potentially. But the museum has vast collections related to it. I was just saying to Nick before, but our biggest documents collection at the museum relates to Nuremberg. We've got 361 boxes, which was the British prosecution team's transcript. It's a fascinating collection because basically at the end of the trial, everything the British prosecution had used in the pursuit of the trial was just boxed up. Went to the Foreign Office for a bit, and then it came here. So a lot of it's kind of cyclostat documents and stuff. But within it, there's like scribbled, handwritten notes from, Maxwell Fyfe to Hartley Shawcross to G.D. Roberts, figuring out how they're going to make this case work. So we've got all of that, but we've also got a load of stuff from members of the prosecution team. I'm intrigued by this guy called G.D. Roberts, who I would hazard to suggest a lot of you won't have heard of, because I hadn't heard of, one of the senior British prosecutors. But he was known as Khaki Roberts, because he played rugby for England. So he had like 3 caps for England and then became a barrister. Real character. We've got a load of stuff from him. He was clearly the kind of the joker in the pack. And all the other various bits, because there's so many different dimensions to the trial, which you wouldn't necessarily think about in the first instance. For example, there's 4 countries involved, 4, obviously lots of countries, but 4 prosecuting countries that all speak, or 2 of which speak different languages. So the trial had to be held in German, French, Russian and English, which meant that they had to pioneer a system of what they called simultaneous translation, which had never been done before. So IBM were like working up this new technology that was being tested upstairs in the courthouse while the courthouse is being built, because the trial started like 4 or 5 months after the war had ended. So they were sending teams off all around Germany to go into these archives, to take everything, to bring it back. Then they had these teams, a lot of whom were former Jewish refugees who'd come here, to Kindertransport, etc. So obviously they were fluent in English and German, going through documents saying this one's interesting, and then that would get translated. So millions of pieces of paper, enormous numbers of people involved, trying to bring what ended up being 22 people to justice in this contained period of time, doing something that had never been done before. It's an amazing moment in history. I was talking about it yesterday, and I heard myself saying it's almost like the sort of breath between the end of the Second World War and the start of the Cold War. Because for a brief period of time, these countries came together in the pursuit of trying to build a kind of a better future, which then just dissolved virtually immediately. Because one of my big bugbears is when people say the Nuremberg Trials, because it's not the Nuremberg Trials, it's the Nuremberg Trial. There was one international trial in Nuremberg, and then the Americans had 12 subsequent trials, but they were American trials. So the subsequent trials are Nuremberg trials, but they're not the Nuremberg trials. There was only one Nuremberg trial. There's going to be another one, but by then relations with the Soviets had started to collapse to the point where it wasn't tenable. So you just get this one brief moment where they all come together, do this incredible thing, and then it goes. So that's what the book's about. The book's about the individuals beneath this. It's not... those of you who are interested in this, you'll know that Anne and John Tusa wrote a fantastic book called The Nuremberg Trial, which is a real kind of doorstopper, which is a forensic pulling apart of the detail of the kind of the legalistic bits of the case. That's not what this book is. This book is pulling photos, documents, looking at how it actually worked, how it actually functioned, how these individuals came together to try and improvise a process and make it stick.
Yeah, I look forward to reading it, and of course with the film coming out. It's probably very good timing for releasing your book as well.
It's a great time. For a quick plug on that, by the way, next Friday we've got, well, obviously you never know till they're here, but they're all confirmed. Rami Malek, Leo Woodall and Michael Shannon from the film and James Vanderbilt, the director, are coming here for an event next Friday evening, if that's of any interest. But yeah, the timing has been fantastic for us. What the film does really, really well, actually, it does lots of things well, but what it does really well, I think, is to sort of bring a sense of like the sort of the visceral excitement of the whole thing. Because obviously, ostensibly, a court case could seem to be quite sort of dry at a distance. Do you know what I mean? Quite emotionally uninvolving, and it's not. They really do get beneath the surface of how kind of kinetic and sort of vigorous the whole thing was.
Yeah. I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions. My glamorous assistant, Mr. Kerry Thomas, has got a microphone. If you can work the technology. If anybody's got a question, do you want to put your hand up? Yeah, there's a lady over there.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I was wondering, I don't know if it's changed since I was at school, but the history of the Channel Islands occupation, I never learned about at school or university. Do you know why that is? Has it changed? I don't know. It always surprises me that no one seems to really know unless you've got a specific
I think because
interest.
we never had any big battles happening in the Channel Islands, really. I think, HMS Rodney shelled Alderney in around D-Day, but there were no real battles fought there. That's why I think it a little bit gets overlooked. And certainly immediately post-war and probably even well into the 70s, people didn't really want to talk about it, or people were worried of upsetting the sensitivities of people around that. I mean, there was a programme called Enemy at the Door, which they actually had a couple of people who'd lived through the occupation who advised on it. It's actually it's all made up, but it is pretty good because what they do is they take... and in one example, there were numerous commando raids on the Channel Islands, again, which people generally don't know about. But they take a number of aspects of different ones of those and mould them all together. So they're not really about real people, but if you know the stories of those raids, well, you can say, well, that's part of this raid, that's part of this one. And they were helped by advisors. But yeah, it gets taught in the schools in the Channel Islands, but outside of that, I'm not really that sure.
But I think that it's a really important point that because it's such a specific case, because the way that history is taught at school tends to be sort of bracketed into broad ideas, but to try and contextualise even the nature of the occupation, the fact that the decision was made to not defend the islands previously, so a number of people were evacuated beforehand, and all of these are very. You can't map that onto like the occupation of the Netherlands or France. It's a quite anomalous case. So I think I can see why, in kind of educational terms, in order for it to be taught, you would need to teach it entirely on its own terms almost. That said, I think there is definitely clearly all those other kind of cultural things that have pushed it to the side. But there does seem to me to be a slight change in mood now. There was a documentary on Channel 4 this year, which Gilly did.
Gilly was on that, and numerous others. Guy Waters was on it as well.
That's it. Yeah. And then there was Dan Snow did some stuff for History Hit recently over there, and there was a film a couple of years ago which didn't make much noise, but it was there with Jenny Seagrave called Another Mother's Son.
Yes, that is a fantastic film based on a true story, and I would highly recommend that film. It's
got Ronan Keating in it, as well, isn't it?
It wasn't filmed in the Channel Islands. That's one of our struggles, is because logistically it's quite difficult for a film production to come to the Channel Islands and film, just because we've got narrow roads. It's quite difficult to get there from the perspective of shipping all your kit to film a major movie or anything like that. But it is a really good film. You can get it on Amazon Prime and various other streaming services at the moment, and I'd highly recommend that. Yeah, and the documentary that was Channel 4, I think that's still available online. I was pretty pleased with how that turned out.
How they did it.
I had a few chats with them about who they might want to involve, what they might want to talk about, and then it all went very quiet. And I thought, wonder what are they just going to go down the sensationalist bits, but they didn't. It was quite balanced, and I thought it was actually pretty good. I just sort of heard from them towards the end when they were getting on with it.
I always think those things are quite a good way of taking the temperature of where something exists in the sort of the popular consciousness. Do you know what I mean? It's not. I think pop culture is a really important resource for lots of different reasons to analyse what people are thinking or talking about. But it's just interesting. You see this kind of surge, and you see that in other things. But I do wonder if it is indicative of an opening up of that conversation about that history.
There does seem to be a lot more interest. I've had an approach to do some work with some schools in France because they I think the 80th anniversary of the liberation and all that sort of thing has brought the profile of it up, the documentaries, things like that, and so they're now talking about, well, actually we need to be comparing what was the occupation in the Channel Islands like compared to the occupation in Normandy and Brittany.
Right.
What was that like? So I'm doing some stuff with them next year, which I'm really looking forward to. They're coming to Guernsey. I'm going over to France, and I'm looking forward to being involved in that.
One thing I will say as well, which I only say this from the perspective of a non-islander who spent some time there, is that for those of you who aren't from Channel Islands, who haven't spent a lot of time there, you wouldn't necessarily be aware of this either, is that May the 9th is a big moment still.
Yeah, it's a public holiday, and it is still, very big moment. We had a royal visit this year. There's always a military parade in the morning, and then there's a big cavalcade in the afternoon. And we had something like 154 military vehicles that were in the cavalcade, and then all sorts of other floats and things like that. So it stems from 1946. They decided that they would have this sort of cavalcade with floats that people had made out of flowers and things like that, just to celebrate the fact that they've been free for a year, and it just kind of carried on.
But it's interesting because I think, obviously VE Day was quite big in this country this year, it's the 80th anniversary, and VJ Day too. But it's a different type of thing, and it's certainly not a national holiday. Whereas in the Channel Islands, there is still this really clear sense that the moment of liberation is a significant part of the island story.
And I think it's quite important because the morning is kind of split into remembrance. So there's the church parade. It's all very formal. We have visiting military units, veterans marching, etc., from various campaigns. Obviously not from the Second World War. And then the afternoon tends to be more focused around fun for families and celebration of the liberation. So I think it divides it up quite nicely. It's almost as if when the noonday gun goes off on Castle Corner, that's the end of the remembrance bit of it, and people reflecting on the horrible times that there were, and then it's celebrating the liberation in the afternoon. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. James, thank you so very much for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Well, there we go. We came to our end of our allotted time for the show. I do hope you've enjoyed listening to James's insights into his career and also talking about the various challenges that face people when recording public history. A big thank you once again to the IWM for hosting us, to Paul Bavill of History Rage, and to everybody else who made us feel so welcome. We'll be back with the next episode next week. We're on to May 1943. We've got air raids from the RAF. We've got shipping being attacked. We've got the government of Jersey, the government of Guernsey in a standoff with the Germans. A pretty nasty rationing order, which takes an even worse turn during May 1943, and much more. The good news is, all the way up until the new year, we are going to be weekly rather than every other week. We were doing this to be able to coincide with Christmas 1943 landing when we're actually celebrating Christmas 2025. Please do follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. Even better, give us a review. Share the links to the podcast with your friends, family and contacts, and we will be eternally grateful. I look forward to speaking to you again next week. Thanks.
He looked to the heavens when he heard the engines hum. A sky full of planes and each one with a bomb. And they're gonna wanna drop them on someone. It's 5 to 7. All his friends and